Sometimes the hardest thing in life is speaking up at the right moment. How many times have you stayed silent, afraid of causing trouble, being misunderstood, or simply thinking, "I don't matter enough"? Today's video tells the story of a boy who knocked on a door in the middle of the night, and a man who thought he had left it all behind, but stood up, not to fight, but to restore the truth. If you've ever faced that heavy kind of silence, stay with us until the end. Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep standing strong together. It was just after midnight when the boy reached the gates. The wind carried a stubborn chill that felt more like November than spring. His jacket was too thin. His shoes, worn at the toes, left faint scuff marks on the cracked sidewalk leading up to the fence. He stood there, motionless, clutching an old canvas bag and a small, dented radio pressed tight to his chest. He didn't knock, not yet. His eyes scanned the tall iron gate, then the building beyond it, quiet, still, lit by only one flickering bulb near the side entrance. There was a sign, faded and chipped. It read, "Willow Creek Elder Care Facility." He read it twice, as if looking for a hidden message in the peeling paint. Jonas was 12, but he moved like someone older, the kind of old age that comes not from age, but from being forced to figure things out too soon. Inside his bag, under a balled-up hoodie and a broken flashlight, was a folded letter, handwritten. The ink had smudged a little from the way he held it in the rain earlier. The letter was from his dad, and the last line was all Jonas could think about now. "If life gets too heavy, find him. His name is Chuck. He'll know what to do." Jonas wasn't sure what exactly that meant, or where to find someone named Chuck, but his dad's voice on the old cassette, recorded years ago, said this is where he should go. So here he was. The radio crackled once as he adjusted the knob. Static hissed. Then silence. He tapped it gently. Nothing but wind. Finally, he stepped forward and pressed the call button near the gate. It buzzed once, then twice. A crackling voice answered, thick with fatigue. "What are you doing here, kid? It's past midnight." Jonas spoke clearly, though his voice wavered at the edges. "I need to talk to someone. I think he's here." The voice grunted. "This ain't a shelter, boy. Go home." Jonas swallowed hard and said, "I'm looking for someone named Chuck. I think he lives here." Silence. Then the voice barked. "Ain't nobody named Chuck here. Now get moving. Before I call someone who'll move you for me." The intercom went dead. Jonas stood still for a moment, not surprised, just disappointed. He set the radio down gently on the sidewalk and sat next to it, knees pulled to his chest. The chill soaked in fast. He pulled the letter out again, though he didn't need to read it. He just wanted to hold it. Something about the paper with his father's handwriting made the moment feel less empty. The street was quiet. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler sputtered and clicked, then went silent again. Jonas leaned his head against the cold gate. He pressed the play button on the radio. A familiar voice filled the still air, not loud, just enough for him to hear. "Hey buddy, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. Or I can't be there when you need me most. But there's someone I trust, someone I owe everything to. If the world ever makes you feel small or lost, go find Chuck. He saved me once. He'll know what to do. Trust him. Even if he doesn't want to be found." Jonas let it play, eyes closed. That's when a shadow moved near the side of the building. Not fast, not trying to be quiet, just steady. The figure stepped into the glow of the flickering bulb. He wore a worn field jacket, the kind old soldiers never throw away. His cap was low, but not low enough to hide the calm weight in his stare. Jonas didn't look up at first. He just kept listening to the tape, as if willing it to offer more than it had. The man stopped a few feet away and said, "Radio's missing an antenna. You'll never pick up anything but ghosts like that." Jonas looked up slowly. The man's face was weathered but still strong. There was a stillness to him, the kind that comes from knowing things no one else wants to know. He didn't smile, didn't scowl, just looked down at the boy as if trying to decide whether this moment mattered. Jonas held the radio closer. "I'm looking for Chuck. Are you him?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he nodded once and said, "Follow me." Jonas scrambled up, grabbing his bag and the radio. They walked in silence around the side of the building. No lights, no cameras, just a side entrance with a keypad and a keyhole. The man entered a code without looking, and the door buzzed open. Inside was a narrow hallway that smelled of old books and something faintly medicinal. Not unpleasant, just used. They passed a few rooms with doors closed and curtains drawn, one with a nightlight glowing dimly, another with the sound of soft breathing from within. The man led Jonas into what looked like a storage room. Boxes, old chairs, a folded cot in the corner. He flipped a switch and a single bulb flickered on overhead. "You can stay here tonight. Just tonight." Jonas looked around. It was more than he expected. "Thank you." The man didn't respond. He walked over to a wooden shelf and placed a small object on it. Jonas couldn't see what, and then turned to leave. As he reached the door, Jonas said, "Are you really him? Chuck?" The man paused. "I used to be." Then he stepped out, leaving the door half open. Jonas sat on the cot, the radio in his lap. He didn't feel safe, exactly, but he felt seen. He rewound the tape and played it again, this time softer. Outside the small room, Chuck stood in the hall. He didn't lean against the wall, or sigh, or shake his head like in the movies. He just listened for a moment. Then he walked away without a sound. In the morning, the staff found Jonas asleep on the cot, curled up with the radio pressed to his chest. The night shift guards swore he didn't let anyone in. Chuck's name never came up on the resident list. It never did. But the director got a note on his desk that day, handwritten. It said simply, "He's with me," and it was signed with a name nobody recognized. Tom Bailey. Jonas wouldn't find out for weeks what that name really meant. But that night, as the cold backed off and the hallway warmed with the first light of dawn, a boy with no home had found something better than a bed. He'd found someone who knew how to listen without asking, who saw without judging, and who knew the weight of silence, and when to break it. That was the beginning, and it was enough. The hallway was quiet in the early morning. Dust floated through the slivers of sunlight, breaking through the blinds and drifting slowly like time forgot to hurry. Jonas rubbed his eyes and sat up on the cot. The old radio was still in his lap. The tape had stopped some time during the night. He didn't rewind it this time. He just let the silence settle. Outside the door, muted footsteps moved across tile. They didn't sound urgent, just part of the place's rhythm. Slow, careful, unbothered. Jonas stood and peeked out into the corridor. No one seemed to notice him. A nurse passed with a tray, humming softly under her breath. He stepped into the hallway, unsure where he was supposed to go. No one had told him to leave, but no one had said he could stay either. The building smelled like wood polish and distant coffee, a kind of comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. He walked slowly, careful not to touch the walls. Chuck was sitting alone in a corner room that looked more like a library than a bedroom. The walls were lined with old books, and the wood shelves were scarred with age. No labels, no decorations, just quiet. He didn't look up when Jonas entered. He was carving something into a small block of wood with a knife that looked older than the boy himself. Jonas stood near the doorway, unsure if he was interrupting. Chuck didn't say anything at first. Then, without looking up, he motioned to the chair across from him. Jonas sat. There was a long pause, not uncomfortable, just still. Chuck finally said, "Breakfast is in the dining hall. Left, Then the second door. "You can eat? Just don't talk too much." Jonas nodded but didn't move. He looked around the room. No photos, no trophies. Just a faded map on one wall and a coat hanging by the window. He noticed the wood Chuck was carving. It was a small bird. Not finished. The wings were only half-shaped. "Why a bird?" Jonas asked quietly. Chuck looked at him for the first time that morning. His eyes were clear, sharp, but not unkind. He answered, "Because some things need to learn how to fly before they understand what held them down." Jonas let that sit. He didn't understand it fully, but it felt like something that might make sense later. He went to breakfast, like Chuck said. The room was half full. People spoke in low voices if they spoke at all. Most just ate and looked out the windows or at their hands. A few of them nodded when they saw him. One old man offered a small smile, toothless but genuine. The food was plain but warm. Eggs, toast, oatmeal that clung to the spoon. It tasted better than Jonas expected. Afterward, he helped clear the dishes. No one asked him to. It just felt right. One of the staff, a woman with a name tag that read Teresa, asked where he came from. He said he was staying with Mr. Bailey. That seemed to satisfy her. He noticed something strange, though. Whenever Chuck's name came up, people either got quiet or changed the subject. Some called him Tom. Others didn't call him anything at all. He asked Teresa later, "Who is he, really?" She shrugged. "Just a quiet old man with good posture and too many scars. Keeps to himself. Doesn't like noise." That night, Jonas slept on the cot again. This time, there was a folded blanket waiting for him. The days passed quietly. Chuck didn't talk much, but he didn't push Jonas away either. Sometimes they sat together in the library. Chuck carved. Jonas read. Other times, Chuck walked the grounds behind the facility. Jonas followed at a distance, learning the pattern of his steps. There was a rhythm to Chuck's life. It didn't involve much talking, but it carried weight, like he was listening to things no one else could hear. One morning, Jonas helped an older woman named Mary find her glasses. She had left them in the garden near the roses. She called him a sweet boy and offered him a hard candy from her sweater pocket. He thanked her, even though the candy was dusty. He kept it in his pocket anyway. Mary was one of the few who smiled with her whole face. But the next day, she didn't come to breakfast. When Jonas asked, someone said she wasn't feeling well. By the third day, she was still gone. He overheard a nurse say Mary had been moved to quiet rest, whatever that meant. Chuck didn't answer when Jonas asked about it. He just looked out the window and said, "Some places treat people like pages in a book. Once they stop talking, they get shelved." Jonas didn't like that. He didn't like how true it felt. He started noticing other things. Residents who used to laugh now sat silent, eyes dull. Staff who avoided eye contact when questions got too close. One afternoon, he passed a room with the door slightly open. Inside, he saw a woman sitting stiffly, her hands shaking. A man in a white coat was talking fast, holding a clipboard. His voice wasn't angry, but it was firm, controlling. He moved past before they saw him. That night, Jonas found Chuck outside, working on something near the tool shed. The sun was dipping low. The light turned everything gold. Jonas asked if Mary was okay. Chuck didn't answer at first. Then he said, "There's a system here. It looks kind, feels clean. But kindness isn't always what it seems." Jonas looked at the gravel under his feet. He wanted to ask more, but something about Chuck's tone told him to wait. Back in the room, Chuck unfolded a large envelope and pulled out a stack of letters. Old ones, yellowed with age. He didn't let Jonas read them, just looked through, quiet. Jonas asked, "Were those from my dad?" Chuck didn't answer, not right away. Then he said, "Your father wasn't just a medic. He was the best kind of soldier, one who didn't want to be one." Jonas felt his throat tighten. He missed him. more than ever. Chuck pulled out a small photo from the envelope. It showed two young men in uniform standing near a tent, arms slung over each other's shoulders. "That's your dad on the left," Chuck said. "Before, I had more lines on my face than sense in my head." Jonas smiled. It was the first real one in days. Later, as he got ready for bed, he asked if Chuck thought people could really change. Chuck looked at him and said, "People don't change because of time. They change when time finally runs out." The next morning, Mary's room was empty. Someone else was moving in. A man with a large suitcase and a tired daughter trailing behind. Jonas wanted to ask where Mary went, but he already knew no one would tell him the truth. So he went to the garden. He sat near the rose bushes, the same spot where she had left her glasses. They were gone now. No trace that she had ever been there. Chuck found him sitting in the dirt. He didn't say anything, just sat beside him and pulled something from his coat pocket. It was the small bird he had been carving, finished now, smooth, simple, with wings just barely open. He handed it to Jonas. Jonas held it gently. It felt warm from Chuck's hand. "Why give it to me?" "Because you're the one who noticed she was missing." They sat in silence a while longer, and though nothing had changed yet, something had begun. Something real. Jonas started waking earlier, before the sun cleared the treetops, before the kitchen lights flicked on. Something inside him shifted, like he wanted to be useful, like he needed to earn his place. He swept the front walkway without being asked, moved chairs back where they belonged. I picked up a dropped slipper for a man who had forgotten which foot it had gone on. He didn't talk much, he just did. Chuck noticed, though he said nothing. I only raised an eyebrow once when Jonas folded the blankets tighter than the staff ever did. That small nod meant more than a thank you. Jonas watched everything. People, routines, who checked the clocks, who stared too long at the windows. He began to understand that silence here wasn't peaceful, it was just practiced. He noticed something strange about the director, Henry Falk, always friendly in passing, firm handshake, smiles that never reached his eyes, but behind those smiles were questions that no one asked out loud. Falk had a rhythm to his rounds, same time, same order. He lingered longer in some rooms, in others they just nodded at the doorway and moved on. Jonas started tracking it in a small notebook he kept hidden in his coat lining. He didn't know why at first, just felt like something important might hide in the patterns. Chuck saw the notebook once. He didn't ask about it. I just said, "Pay attention to the places where people stop making noise. That's where the truth hides." Jonas didn't fully understand, but he kept writing anyway. One Tuesday, Jonas overheard two staff members whispering near the break room, something about incentives. Falk had started pushing them to log uncooperative behavior more often. The phrase stuck in Jonas's head like a splinter. That same afternoon, an older man named Mr. Green was wheeled out of the TV room mid-show. He had spilled juice on the floor, then raised his voice when they told him to go to bed early. The next morning, his room was empty. His name was erased from the door like he had never been there at all. Jonas asked Chuck what happened. Chuck didn't answer, just said, "Some systems fix problems by pretending they don't exist." Jonas felt a knot in his chest. He didn't know how to name it, but it grew heavier each day. One night, Jonas was walking back from the kitchen when he passed the office. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, he saw Falk seated at his desk, talking on a headset. He was smiling, but his words were sharp. Yes, I told you, we file the transfer reports under therapeutic grounds. The families don't question it. They signed the general waiver. Trust me, we have it covered." Jonas backed away before he was seen. His heart thudded in his ears. He didn't understand every word, but he knew one thing. Falk wasn't just a friendly administrator. He was in control of something deeper. Something wrong. He told Chuck what he heard. Chuck didn't blink, didn't panic. He simply said, "It's easier to hide control inside kindness. People don't resist what feels polite." Jonas sat with that thought all night. The next few days felt colder, even though the weather hadn't changed. Jonas saw less laughter, more pills, more silence. A new resident, a woman named Ruth, arrived with bright eyes and a camera around her neck. 2 days later, the camera was gone, and her eyes looked heavier. Jonas asked her about it. She didn't remember even bringing a camera. He felt his stomach drop. He brought it up to Chuck, said something's not right. Chuck studied him, then said, "You're seeing it now. The question is, what do you plan to do with what you see?" Jonas didn't have an answer. That evening, he walked past Falk's office again. This time the door was shut tight, no voices. But a folder had been left on the floor outside, forgotten, unmarked. He picked it up and tucked it inside his jacket. Didn't open it until he was back in the cot room. Under a blanket, using his flashlight, he flipped through the pages. It was full of signatures, consent forms, transfer orders. Some had names he recognized: Mary, Mr. Green, all marked with a box that said cognitive decline, recommended isolation. But the handwriting looked wrong. Uniform, almost copied, and one signature looked eerily like Mary's. But Jonas had once helped her write her name. Her letters used to wobble. This signature didn't. The next morning, Chuck found Jonas pacing in the garden. Jonas handed him the folder, said nothing. Chuck flipped through it. His face didn't change. Not even when he reached the falsified pages. He closed the folder and said, "Paper doesn't lie, people do." That night, Jonas couldn't sleep. He played the tape from his father again, just the part about Chuck, about trust, about knowing when to ask for help. He wondered what kind of man his father really was. Not just the voice on the tape, but the man Chuck once knew. Jonas asked Chuck the next morning. Chuck took a long breath, then said, "Your dad was the kind of man who stepped between people and danger even when he wasn't asked to. He didn't need orders, just a purpose." Jonas let the words sink in. "Did he save people?" Jonas asked. "More than once. But the one he was proudest of was you." Jonas didn't speak. He just looked down at his hands. They were starting to look older to him. Not bigger, just different. Like they had touched more than a boy's hands should. He made a decision that day. He started asking questions. Polite ones at first, to staff, to residents. "Do you remember when Mary left? Do you know where Mr. Green went? Did anyone check on Ruth today?" Most people didn't answer, but some did, and what they said didn't match what Falk claimed in his daily announcements. Jonas started writing it all down. One afternoon he went into the recreation room and found Ruth sitting by the window. She looked tired, but aware. He asked, "Do you remember bringing a camera when you arrived?" She blinked, then said, "I think so. It had a leather strap. My husband gave it to me." "Why?" "Because I think someone took it, or made you forget it." Ruth's hand trembled. She looked down at her lap. "I haven't felt like myself since I got here," she whispered. Jonas put a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to find out what's happening, I promise." He meant it. Later that night, Jonas found Chuck working in the toolroom, sanding an old piece of wood. He said, "I want to do something. I want to stop this." Chuck didn't look up. He said, "Then understand this first. You don't fight shadows by yelling at the dark. You light a match. You show others where to look." Jonas nodded, then asked, "Will you help me?" Chuck looked at him then, long and slow. "Not yet. Not until I see what kind of match you are." Jonas didn't feel insulted. He felt challenged. He stayed up that night, writing. Notes, names, questions. He organized everything he'd gathered. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He placed the folder next to the small wooden bird Chuck had given him. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time since his father died, he didn't feel lost. He felt ready. The photo was folded twice, its edges soft from time and fingertips. Jonas had found it tucked inside an old hardcover book on Chuck's shelf, wedged between pages of notes and a pressed leaf that crumbled when touched. He didn't open it right away. He waited until Chuck was gone on one of his early morning walks, the ones where he disappeared just long enough to be remembered but not followed. Jonas sat on the floor back against the bookshelf and opened the photo carefully. Two men stood side by side, younger, lighter in the face. The one on the left wore a crooked grin and a patch on his shoulder. Jonas recognized him instantly. It was his father. The other man stood straighter, more reserved, but unmistakably Chuck. There was something about the way they stood, not posed, just present, like they knew this moment wasn't for bragging, but for remembering. On the back of the photo, in faded pen, were 5 words. "If I fall, you stand." Jonas ran his thumb over them again and again. He tucked the photo into his notebook, the one where he had logged everything, names, transfers, conversations that didn't line up. It wasn't perfect, but it was full. That night, Chuck returned from his walk with a slight limp. He didn't mention it, and Jonas didn't ask. They sat together in silence for a while before Jonas reached into his pocket and slid the photo onto the table. Chuck didn't touch it. He just looked at it for a long time. Jonas asked what happened in the photo. Chuck took a breath that sounded heavier than usual. Then he said, "That was taken in '94. 2 weeks before your father walked out of the uniform for good. He didn't want to fight anymore. He wanted to heal." Jonas asked, "Did you ever wish he stayed?" Chuck shook his head. He made his choice, the right one. He gave people their strength back when they lost it, not by yelling, just by showing up. Jonas felt the words settle in, like dust, but warmer. He asked, "Did he ask you to look after me?" Chuck finally turned his eyes toward him. "Your father didn't ask for favors, but he left one request in a letter I never planned to read. Only if something ever happened to him." Jonas waited. Chuck said, "That letter's in the drawer behind you." Jonas reached in. The paper was old. The handwriting was familiar. His name was at the top. One line stood out more than the rest. "If he finds you, it means I couldn't protect him." "But you still can." Jonas folded the letter back slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. From that day, something changed. Chuck started walking with Jonas instead of alone. He showed him things around the facility that others didn't notice. The side exits, the old record room, the stairwell door that never locked properly. Jonas kept taking notes. He noticed which nurses acted nervously around Falk, which residents started slurring their words after taking new pills. He marked dates, times, and room numbers. Then, one morning, he was gone. Not Chuck. Jonas. A staff member came to wake him and found the cot empty. His notebook is still there, radio unplugged. No sign of struggle, just absence. Chuck didn't say much, just stared at the empty space where the blanket had been folded. Later that afternoon, Falk announced a routine mental health transfer, said the boy was having difficulty adjusting, required further observation off-site, no need to worry. Chuck stood in the back of the room, arms folded. No one asked questions, not out loud. But that night, Chuck opened the panel under his bed and pulled out a lockbox. Inside were 3 items: a key, a flash drive, and an old ID badge from a government agency no longer listed in public databases. He took them and walked to the West Wing. No one has visited the part of the building since the renovations. He bypassed the electronic lock using the old panel near the emergency lights. The door creaked open just enough for him to slip through. Inside, dust and wires clung to every surface. But deeper in, behind a storage rack, he found it. The old server cabinet, still live, still blinking. He connected the flash drive. Screens lit up. He typed a few commands. Accessed facility logs from the past 18 months. Movement records, transfer orders, security footage. It was all there. One file was marked as confidential. Medical reassessment. Subject J. Bishop, dated the night Jonas disappeared. Chuck read it. His jaw tightened. Then he closed the file, copied everything and powered down the unit. He knew where they had taken the boy, and he knew he was going to bring him back. The next morning, Chuck walked into the director's office, unannounced. Falk looked up, surprised but composed. Chuck placed the flash drive on the desk. Falk raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Chuck replied. "Evidence, you're going to need it." Falk reached for the intercom, but Chuck stepped forward. "I wouldn't unless you want everyone to hear what you've been doing." Felt froze. Chuck leaned in. "You took a child under false medical pretenses. You forged transfers. You drugged the elderly into silence, and you did it behind a desk. That makes you a coward with a clipboard." Falk forced a smile. "You don't have proof," Chuck said. "Then let's test that theory in court." For a moment, neither man moved. The air between them turned sharp. Then Chuck stepped back. His voice dropped. "You crossed a line when you touched the boy. Now I'm stepping in." He turned and walked out without waiting for a reply. Within the hour, he was in his truck. The last time he had driven this route was years ago, on the way to bury a friend who died before saying what needed to be said. Now he was driving to pull a child out of a place where silence was used like a weapon. He knew the address, the off-site observation unit. It was just another name for a holding ward. He pulled into the gravel lot as the sky turned pale. The guard at the gate barely looked up before Chuck showed him a badge. The guard let him pass without a word. Inside, Chuck walked the hallways like he belonged there, past nurses, past patients, past locked doors. He found Jonas in a side room, alone, awake, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. Jonas didn't speak when he saw him. He just blinked once, like his eyes were adjusting to something brighter than they expected. Chuck opened the door and said, "Get up, we're going." Jonas rose slowly. No resistance, just steady. They didn't run. They didn't need to. They walked out the front like they'd never been stopped. On the way back, neither said much. But when they passed the last town line, Jonas looked at Chuck and asked, "Why now?" Chuck didn't take his eyes off the road. "Because you've seen enough. Now you need to learn what to do with it." Jonas nodded. And for the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe. The air felt different when they returned. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like the building itself knew something had shifted and was waiting to see what came next. Jonas didn't go straight to his cot. He walked through the hallway like he belonged there, like the silence that once held him back had run out of ways to stop him. Some of the residents noticed. They didn't say much, but their eyes followed him. A few nodded. One old man with shaky hands gave him a half salute. Chuck didn't rush. He moved with purpose, but not with noise. He stopped in the dining hall, looked around, then walked to the front desk and left a folded envelope with the receptionist. Inside was a list, names, dates, files, and a sentence in his handwriting. "This ends now." The next morning, Falk didn't show for his usual walkthrough. The staff acted normally, but something in their steps said they were listening harder than before. Jonas stayed close to Chuck that day, not because he felt scared, but because he wanted to see what came next. He wanted to learn how someone told the truth without yelling. Chuck gathered a few things from his room. Not much, just the essentials. A flash drive, a key, the same photo Jonas had found weeks earlier. Then he walked to the main lounge. The residents were already gathering there. Something had drawn them. Maybe instinct. Maybe hope. Maybe they just wanted to be near someone who wasn't afraid to say what others only thought. Chuck stood near the whiteboard at the front of the room. He didn't clear his throat or tap a glass. He just waited. When the room settled, he began. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I don't wear a badge or carry a title. But I know what it looks like when power goes unchecked. He looked around the room. No one moved. No one whispered. You've all seen it. Some of you have lived through worse. Some of you have learned how to stay quiet to keep the peace. But peace built on fear isn't peace. It's a cage. Jonas stood at the side, hands in his pockets. He watched the faces shift. Not dramatically, just the small signs. A lifted chin, a straighter back, a breath held and then released. Chuck continued. This place is not broken. The building is fine, the routines work, but what runs it has lost its way, and no one should be afraid to speak just to stay safe. He paused. The weight of the room rested in his hands now. You were promised dignity. What you got was control. That ends today. He stepped aside, motioned to Jonas, who walked forward holding a small black device. They played back the file, the one from the off-site transfer center. Falk's voice is giving instructions. Signing off on a boy's removal under false terms. Then another. A nurse explained how signatures were collected without consent and how pressure was placed on families who didn't understand the fine print. The room didn't gasp. It didn't erupt. It just listened. That was enough. When the file ended, Chuck placed the device down. Some people think justice needs to be loud, but sometimes it just needs to be seen. One of the residents raised her hand. She asked if they would be safe now. Chuck nodded. You've always been worth protecting. Now it's just time someone did it without asking for anything in return. That afternoon, a letter was hand-delivered to the board of directors. Attached were copies of the recordings, logs, and the history of false transfers. The envelope also included a single line typed in bold. This is not revenge. This is a correction. By the next day, Falk was gone. No announcement, no goodbye. The staff didn't ask questions. They just got quieter. Some avoided eye contact. Others walked straighter, like they were relieved. But not everyone felt settled. A few of the younger aides began whispering that Chuck had no real authority, that he was just an old man playing hero. Those things weren't that bad. Word reached Chuck the next morning. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He went back to the lounge and wrote something new on the whiteboard. Strength is not volume, it's clarity. Then he walked away. Jonas found him later near the rose garden, same place Mary used to sit. He asked if Chuck felt finished. Chuck shook his head. You don't fix years of silence with one speech. You just hold the door open a little longer. Jonas sat beside him. I don't think I ever said thank you, Jonas said. You don't need to, just keep doing the right thing even when it's quiet. That night, Jonas brought out the notebook again, not to log wrongs, but to write what had changed. He listed the names of residents who had started speaking up. Small things, requests, comments, compliments, but it mattered. He drew a line under the list and wrote, "The silence is breaking." In the following days, a few parents of staff members called to ask about the facility. Some were concerned, some were proud. News hadn't spread wide yet, but whispers had turned into ripples. Then the letter arrived. From the oversight board. They were conducting a full audit. Chuck read the letter and folded it twice. Then he placed it under the wooden bird on the shelf. Jonas asked if that meant things would change for good. Chuck answered, "It means people are finally looking where they used to close their eyes." That night, Jonas sat on the cot holding the old radio. He played the tape again, but not for comfort. He listened with new ears. His father's voice no longer sounded like a lifeline, it sounded like a torch. The next morning, Jonas woke early. He found Chuck already outside, watching the sun rise. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just stood, side by side, like two people who knew what it meant to keep standing, even after the worst had tried to knock them down. The wind rolled gently across the grass that morning. It wasn't loud, but it carried something new, something quiet, but awake. The kind of air that made people pause without knowing why. Jonas stood at the edge of the yard, looking out over the field where the garden used to be. Half of it had turned into a space for walking drills. The other half held cones, rolled-up mats, and a cooler full of water bottles. It didn't look like a gym. It looked like a place where people showed up because something in them needed to. Chuck came out with 2 folding chairs. He set one down and kept the other for himself. He sat without a word and watched the kids arrive one by one. They came quietly. No one needed to tell them to form a circle or take off their shoes. They just knew. Their voices stayed soft. Their eyes scanned for Chuck, not for approval but for orientation. Jonas had begun leading the warm-up now. He didn't shout. He used his hands. He walked among them, correcting with gentle taps on the shoulder or a whisper when someone's balance was off. Chuck watched it all from his chair, arms crossed, eyes steady. The trident coin sat in Jonas's pocket, close to his palm. He didn't pull it out often, but he always knew where it was. It had become less of a trophy and more of a question. A reminder that standing still wasn't the same as standing for something. One evening, after the last student had left, a parent lingered at the gate. She stood for a long moment, holding her purse close to her chest. Chuck walked over and asked if she needed anything. She said her son used to stutter, used to hide behind doors. Since coming here, he has started speaking up, not louder, just clearer. Chuck didn't respond with a speech. He simply nodded and said, "That's what happens when you let kids find their own footing." In the weeks that followed, more showed up. Some came with sneakers that were too big. Others carried bags with nothing in them but the want to belong. Chuck never asked their names. He let them offer it when they were ready. The grass wore down in places, footprints overlapped, dirt peeked through, but no one complained. There were no trophies, no ranks, only rhythm and trust. Chuck kept his teaching quiet. A tilt of the chin here, a slow breath there. He taught them when not to move as much as how to move. Most lessons weren't about punching, they were about presence. He often said, "Real strength is knowing when not to swing." Jonas listened harder to that than anything. He stopped needing to prove himself. He started showing others how to center their balance, even when the world pulled at their shoulders. One day, a girl named Ellie asked if this would ever become an official gym. Chuck looked around and said, "It already is. We just don't need mirrors or neon signs to make it real." She smiled and said she understood. A few days later, she returned with a folder. Inside were forms, signatures from parents, a note that read, "We want to help you grow this." Chuck read each page slowly, then set them down and asked, "Why does it work?" Ellie said, "Because no one here tries to be the loudest." Chuck folded the folder and placed it under his chair. "That's your answer," he said. "That's how you protect something worth keeping." Not long after, a letter arrived from the National Federation. The Ethics Committee had reviewed the evidence from the facility. Falk's license was officially revoked. The organization released a statement apologizing for the oversight and promised new audits across affiliated centers. Chuck read it in silence. Then, I tossed it onto the table and went back to watching footwork drills in the yard. That evening, Jonas sat next to him on the porch. He asked if Chuck ever thought about opening something permanent. With mats, a roof, maybe a real name on the door. Chuck said roofs are overrated, and names only matter to people who forget how they started. Jonas nodded, then asked, "So what do we call this?" Chuck leaned back and looked at the stars just beginning to poke through the sky. "Call it whatever you want," he said, "but make sure it stands for something when I'm not around to explain it." The next day, Jonas led the group through a full routine, no missteps, no lost focus. When it ended, they circled up without being asked. Chuck stepped forward, holding the trident coin. He held it between two fingers. The light caught the edges just enough to remind everyone it had been passed down, not won. "I used to carry this," he said, "not to show off. I just wanted to remind myself who I had to be, even when no one was watching." He walked toward Jonas and placed it in his hand. "You earned this, not for what you did at the facility, but for what you chose to do after. You didn't let anger decide who you'd become." Jonas took it quietly, closed his fingers over the metal. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just stood taller. Later, after the group had gone, Chuck and Jonas sat on the back steps. The yard was still. One glove had been left behind near a cone. Jonas noticed it, but didn't move to grab it. He asked, "Do you ever think about disappearing again?" Chuck said, "I think about what disappears when no one stands still long enough to see what matters." They watched the dusk spread across the hill. Jonas turned the coin in his hand and asked, "What do I do with this now?" Chuck replied, "You carry it until you meet someone who needs it more than you do." That night, Jonas didn't play the tape. He didn't need to. His father's voice lived in how he walked, in how he led, in how he listened. The coin was just a reminder. The real legacy had always been choice. And he chose to show up, not to be known, but to be counted when it mattered. By the end of the season, the group had doubled. Some came from other towns, some were sent by friends, some had no idea what they were looking for until they found a yard with no walls and a man who taught them how to breathe before they fought. One day, a small boy joined the circle, barefoot, nervous. He stumbled during the first drill and looked down in shame. Another student reached out a hand, pulled him up. No teasing, no words, just an action that said, "You get to try again." Jonas watched from the center. Chuck watched from the edge. Neither spoke, but they both knew what they were building. It wasn't a gym. It was a ground where presence became strength, where silence was allowed, and where no one had to earn the right to be seen. Chuck stood and stretched his back. He said, "We'll need more mats." Jonas replied, "There's more in the garage." Chuck nodded. "But first, you lead." That's how it ended. Not with applause, not with a sign, but with a boy who kept walking forward, and a man who knew when to hand him the mat. The mornings came earlier now, not because the sun rose faster, but because more people were arriving before it did. The grass behind Chuck's house had turned to dirt in most places, packed down by bare feet and careful steps. It no longer looked like a backyard. It looked like a space people trusted. Jonas rolled out the mats before anyone asked. His movements were steady, like someone who no longer second-guessed the weight of what he was carrying. The other kids followed his lead. They didn't wait for permission. They waited for his signal. Chuck watched it all from the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. He didn't speak often during warm-ups. He didn't need to. His silence had earned its place. Most of the kids came with stories they didn't know how to tell. Some had been through too much. Some just needed a place to be something other than scared. They all found something in that yard. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't school. It was something in between. A space to remember how to breathe before reacting. One girl, maybe 10, wore her brother's old sneakers with socks that slid down. She fell twice during footwork, but got back up without waiting for help. Another boy, taller than the rest, used to fake injuries to avoid drills. Now he led stretches without being asked. He didn't shout, he just moved, and others followed. Jonas noticed everything. He'd grown quieter, but not withdrawn. More like someone learning how to hold space without filling it with noise. He kept the trident coin in his pocket, not for luck, just to remind himself why he showed up every day. Some afternoons, parents lingered along the fence. They didn't interrupt, they just watched. A few would nod at Chuck on their way out. A silent thank you passed in eye contact. Once, a father approached and said his son hadn't spoken to anyone in months until he came here. Now he asked questions on the way home. It was not about fights, but about discipline, posture, and staying calm when someone pushed him too far. Chuck just said, "He's learning how to hold his ground. That's the first step toward everything else." In the evenings, after everyone left, Chuck and Jonas sat on the back steps. No agenda, no lessons, just the comfort of ending the day beside someone who understood what didn't need to be said out loud. The notebook Jonas had once filled with names and questions was now used for something else. He tracked each student. Not just their progress, but their patterns. Who showed up early, who lingered after, who took care of others when no one asked. He started keeping 2 lists, one for skills, one for character. Chuck saw the lists once, but didn't comment. He just added one word to the top of the second page: legacy. It wasn't about who hit harder, it was about who others looked to when things got quiet. Then one day, Chuck handed Jonas a folded paper. It was a request from the community center downtown. They'd heard about the group. They wanted to offer space for indoor sessions through the winter. Jonas read it twice. He asked if Chuck was going to accept. Chuck said, "I'm not the one they're inviting, you are." Jonas felt the weight of that land slowly. He asked if he was ready. Chuck smiled and said, "You took the hit, you kept your voice, you stepped back in. That makes you a leader." Jonas didn't answer right away, but he folded the paper and placed it next to the coin in his pocket. The next week, the group met at the new space. It had a roof, mirrors on the wall, a rubber floor that bounced slightly under each step. It felt different, sharper, cleaner. But something remained. They moved the same, watched each other the same. Chuck still stood by the entrance, arms crossed, saying little. Jonas opened the session with a warm-up that ended in a moment of stillness. He asked everyone to close their eyes, to listen to their breathing, to remember what brought them here. Not who hurt them, but what did they want to be strong for. When they opened their eyes, no one spoke, but everyone stood a little taller. That night, a girl named Naomi waited after class. She was the youngest, but already one of the most focused. She asked Jonas how he stayed calm when someone mocked him. He thought for a moment, then said, "I stopped letting their voice decide what mine sounded like." She nodded and ran to catch up with her older brother. Chuck walked over and handed Jonas the old wooden bird. He said, "When I first carved this, I thought I was making something to pass time. Turns out I was just trying to remind myself what it meant to help something fly." Jonas looked down at the smooth edges. He remembered the day Chuck gave it to him, back when everything felt heavier than he could hold. He asked if Chuck ever missed being in charge. Chuck shook his head. Leadership isn't about holding the spotlight, it's about knowing when to step out of it. That Sunday, the group decided to name themselves. Nothing official, just something to write on the whiteboard. After a long discussion, someone suggested groundwork. It fit. They weren't building trophies, they were laying foundations. Word spread quietly. No flyers, no social media, just parents telling other parents. Kids are inviting their cousins. Neighbors are asking questions during coffee runs. One afternoon, a teacher showed up with a clipboard, said she'd heard about what was happening, asked if they needed volunteers. Chuck handed her a towel and said, "If you're here, you're already part of it." The walls began to fill with names, not rankings, just first names. Each one was written after a full month of attendance. No one asked what it meant, but everyone cared when theirs went up. Jonas kept teaching. Chuck kept watching. Sometimes he stepped in to correct a stance. Other times he just stood near someone who was about to give up. That was enough. One boy brought a small tape recorder, said his grandfather used to use it, asked if he could record the sessions. Jonas said yes, as long as it didn't distract. A week later, the boy played back a recording. In it, Jonas could be heard saying, "You don't need to be loud to be clear." Chuck chuckled. "I told Jonas that it looks like your voice is going places without you now." In late fall, a former student from the old facility showed up. He didn't speak right away, just watched. Then he asked if he could join. Said he hadn't trained since the closure. Said everything had felt too heavy. Chuck nodded toward Jonas. "He's the one running this now. Ask him." Jonas didn't hesitate. He said yes. Then he paired him with someone smaller, the kind of pairing Chuck always used to do. After the session, the new student said it felt different. He wasn't afraid of getting it wrong anymore. Jonas smiled and said, "That's how you know you're in the right place." When the first snow fell, they cleared space near the back entrance for boots and coats. Chuck kept showing up, but more often now he stayed outside, watching through the window. One night, Jonas joined him outside. The wind was sharp. The air smelled of smoke from a distant chimney. He asked if Chuck was planning to leave. Chuck said, "I already have, the day you stopped looking at me for every answer." Jonas looked down at the coin in his hand. He asked, "So, when do I pass this on?" Chuck replied, "When you see someone standing in a storm without even realizing they're wet." Jonas thought about that the whole walk home. The next morning, a new student arrived. She didn't speak, just stood off to the side, gripping a backpack too tightly for comfort. Jonas walked over and asked if she'd like to join. She shook her head no, but stayed. He let her watch. By the end of the session, she was sitting on the edge of a mat, eyes following every movement. Jonas walked over, knelt down and set the coin beside her. He said, "You don't have to earn this. You just have to carry it until you find someone who needs it more." She didn't speak, just nodded. Chuck saw it from the outside, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled without holding anything back. That was the day Jonas knew he didn't need to ask what came next, because the next had already begun. The days moved more slowly after the snow, not because there was less to do, but because more of it mattered now. The air had changed. Even time seemed to take longer, pauses between moments. Jonas no longer waited to be asked. He rose before sunrise. He swept the floors of the training space, not because they were dirty, but because order had become part of the practice. The coin had passed from his hand to another. He still remembered its weight, but not as something he had lost. More like something that had fulfilled its purpose. Chuck hadn't said much in the past week. He still showed up, still leaned on the frame of the back door, arms crossed, watching with the same steady gaze. But the way he looked at Jonas had shifted. There was no testing left to do. One morning, Chuck stayed inside while the others trained. Jonas noticed, but didn't interrupt. He led the drills, corrected posture, reminded the younger ones to listen to their breath when they got too tense. At the end, he gathered the group near the wall and asked a question, not what they had learnt, but what they had noticed. One girl said she noticed she didn't panic when someone moved faster than her. A boy said he noticed that standing still felt harder than punching. Jonas nodded. Then he added something of his own. He said, "Presence is like a shadow. It follows you when the light hits right, but when you step into the dark, you have to become your own." They sat with that. No one rushed to leave. Later that evening, Chuck finally spoke. He told Jonas there was something in the garage he hadn't touched in years, said it was time. They went together. The space smelled of old rubber and oil. Shelves leaned with boxes from other decades. Chuck pulled out a duffel bag. Inside was a folded tarp, a binder, and a set of black and white photos. He laid them on the workbench. The binder was filled with old lesson plans, not typed, handwritten, edges curled from moisture, notes in the margins. Jonas flicked through them slowly. One section had dates from the 1980s. These were the sessions Chuck once taught in a different life, before the badge, before the silence. He said he used to run workshops for kids like Jonas. But something changed. People wanted faster results, shortcuts, combat without context. So he stepped away. Jonas asked why he kept the notes. Chuck said, "Because some things you don't save for others. You save them to remember who you were when you still believed it mattered." Jonas looked up and said, "It still does." They spent the next few days organizing the binder, not to recreate it, but to learn from it. Jonas added new pages, adjusted old drills, updated warm-ups to match what the new generation needed. Chuck watched without interfering. He said less and less, but every word he did say held more. Then, one afternoon, a letter came in the mail. It was handwritten, no return address. It simply read, "I used to train under Coach Trent. I left before things got worse. I heard what you did. I'd like to help if you're building something better." Jonas read it out loud. Chuck just nodded. He said, "That's what happens when truth grows roots. People start digging where they were told not to look." That week, more messages came, quiet ones, emails, notes. Kids who trained under bad systems, parents who trusted the wrong people. They didn't want revenge, they wanted redemption. Chuck printed every letter. He kept them in a folder labeled "After." One cold morning, Jonas walked outside to find Chuck already standing by the fence. He wasn't wearing his coat, just a thick flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up. He said, "I think it's time I step back." Jonas blinked, not out of surprise, but because some part of him had known this was coming. Chuck continued, "This space isn't mine anymore. It was never meant to be. I was just holding the ground until someone younger could take it further." Jonas didn't argue. He knew better now than to try to stop a man who moved only when it mattered. He said, "So what will you do?" Chuck shrugged. "Maybe teach one-on-one. Maybe just rest. There's a difference between disappearing and knowing when to be quiet." The next day, Chuck didn't show up, for the first time in months. The students noticed. Jonas explained nothing, he just led with calm. A few asked if Chuck was coming back. Jonas said, "He didn't leave, he just passed us the map." That evening, Jonas walked alone to Chuck's house. He found him on the porch, carving again. This time, it wasn't a bird. It was a flame. He asked Chuck what it meant. Chuck said, "Fire can burn or warm. Depends on who's holding it." Jonas sat down beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. Later, Chuck handed Jonas the carving. He said, "Don't keep this. Pass it on when someone earns it." Jonas held it gently. It felt warm, even though the air was cold. Weeks passed. The program kept growing. Not by design, by word. It started showing up with questions before they knew how to punch. Parents started asking about values before asking about results. One even asked if there would be a belt system. Jonas said, "We don't measure by color. We measure by consistency." In spring, a reporter visited. She was young, curious, not looking for a scandal, just a story. She sat in the back, took notes, and said little. Afterward, she asked Jonas what made their group different. He said, "We don't teach people how to fight. We teach them how to stop needing to." She wrote that down word for word. Before she left, she asked if she could talk to the founder. Jonas pointed to the empty porch. He said, "He's already told you everything, you just didn't hear it yet." The article ran 2 weeks later. It didn't go viral, but it reached the inbox of a retired school principal. He called Jonas and offered to donate mats, cones, and even portable mirrors. Jonas said yes to the mats, no to the mirrors. He said, "We train to be seen by each other, not by our reflections." By summer, the space had become a home for dozens of students. Not just in training, but in voice. One girl started a journal war where students could post short thoughts. Another boy designed a quiet signal so people could ask for space without feeling ashamed. Jonas didn't plan any of it. He just let it grow. Chuck visited now and then. Always quiet, always watching. Sometimes he sat beside a student who struggled. Sometimes he left before anyone noticed. But when he did stay, his presence still centered the room. One evening, Jonas asked him if he was proud. Chuck said, "Pride doesn't come from being right. It comes from helping others stand taller than you did." That fall, a mother approached Jonas. Her daughter had stopped getting in fights at school, not because she learned to hit better, but because she learned when not to. She said, "You changed her," Jonas replied. "She did that herself. I just gave her space." After she left, Chuck said, "That's the difference between teaching and leading." Jonas nodded, and for the first time, he felt like both. The notebook that once tracked wrongs now held victories. Not flashy ones, just small wins. A boy who spoke up. A girl who asked to lead a drill. A group that stayed late to clean. Each name was circled, not ranked, just honored. Then one day, Chuck didn't come back. No message, no warning, just an empty porch. Jonas waited a week before visiting the house. The door was locked. Inside, everything was clean. No mess, no clutter, just a note on the kitchen table. It read, "Don't come looking." I didn't disappear. I stepped aside. On the back, a second sentence. "You know what to do next." Jonas folded the note and placed it in his coat. He didn't tell anyone. But that night he stood in front of the group and said, "From here on, this belongs to all of us." He erased the board, wrote one word, "earned." And in that moment they didn't cheer. They just stood a little taller, because they knew the torch hadn't been dropped. It had been passed.